I was ignorant. Oh boy, it was a big one too. And we've all had those moments, right? Where someone comes along and exposes us to a new idea or a new concept or something in history we didn't know, and it's whoop, the rug's pulled out from under us. And then we have to make a decision, don't we? We have to decide if we want to move forward in a deeply uncomfortable but courageous way, or if we want to retreat in fear and willful ignorance. My first rug-pulling moment, of which, of course, there are many, was when I was 11. And I was visiting the Garden of the Gods, which, if you don't know, is this amazing, beautiful park south of here in Colorado Springs. And it also happens to be a very sacred and important site to the indigenous people of this region. Now, I grew up in a suburb south of Philadelphia. It was a very segregated area. In fact, I think maybe there was one student of color in our entire class. And so my exposure to history and ideas were relatively limited. I didn't really think about diversity at all, being a white male. And so when I walked into the Garden of the Gods Visitor Center, and I don't know how I got this idea, but somehow I had come to believe through my education and my experiences and the things I've watched on TV thus far that all indigenous people in this country were gone, that they were a thing of the past. And then here was this Navajo woman standing in the visitor center. And my little 11-year-old brain was kind of like, error, 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 does not compute. And I didn't know what to do with this experience. And so this planted a seed in me, a seed that took a long time to take root, really not until college. But that seed started to get me to ask questions. And I believe it's this seed that is the reason I became an anthropologist, the reason I became a writer. See, we live in the world of the imagination. We imagine the past. Because, a quick survey, who in this audience has a time machine? Does anyone have a time machine? Anyone? Oh, I'm so disappointed. No one ever has a time machine, right? So we have to imagine our past. We have to imagine history. And so we're told our lives, what we're supposed to imagine, by watching media, by reading history, by hearing stories. We live in that imagination. But it doesn't just stop with history, does it? You imagine that perfect person in your future, the perfect career. You have so many hopes that you imagine, so many dreams you imagine, but you also have fears and anxieties and worries. We live so deeply in our imagination, constantly. We never really leave it, do we? We're always living in the past or the future, or imagining even, what's for lunch. And this is why me and my co-author, Kara Wellstrom, decided to write a book called Build Better Worlds, an introduction to anthropology for game designers, fiction writers, and filmmakers, because we started to see that it's really important how you build that imagination, that it matters for the purposes of diversity, for the purposes of communication, for the purposes of storytelling. How we imagine things matters. So, her being a biological anthropologist and me being a cultural anthropologist kind of joined forces because she knows all the icky body stuff way better than I do. And we sat down and we looked at a lot of these fictional worlds, and we realized if they just understood a little bit about cultural systems, a little bit about how difference works, then maybe the stories told in the future can be even better. And our imagination can run wild. And maybe we can solve more problems in the world because we're thinking with our imagination in a better way. So in this book, of course, we do, the standard intro to cultural anthropology stuff where you learn about race, class, gender, evolution, religion, all of these different aspects of our identities and cultures and how they form and how they change and move. But another thing we did was we built a model. And this model was specifically and originally created for building better characters. And this model is called the 3 C's: context, conditions, and choices. So using this model, understanding a character's context, their conditions, and their choices, you can build really interesting 3-dimensional characters, and then you can pit them against another character who's really well constructed, and it's really interesting. But we realized very quickly that this was also a model for understanding one another. Context. What is context? Context is the cultural system into which you're born. It includes all the different religions, all the languages and dialects, all the ways that we tell stories of the past and the present and how we imagine the future. It is everything in your cultural sphere, including the time you're born in history, because you are a contextual being. You're born in a specific moment, in a specific time, in a specific place, and those things matter because they shape the way we think. So if we're going to use a metaphor, a context would be a neighborhood. It would be an entire neighborhood full of different people with different ideas and experiences. And then if we move on to conditions, it's your house in the neighborhood, your specific gender, your specific sexuality, your specific religion and dialect and class status. So within the neighborhood, you have a house of your own experience. And that house, of course, includes your happiest memories and your worst tragedies. And if you take these 2 things, context and conditions, you can then begin to understand the choices that someone makes. You're never going to understand all those choices, of course not. But you can understand a great deal of these choices. And you can use this to do things like understand that jerk at work. You know the one, right? Right? Oh, I see. Yeah, you know the one I'm talking about, right? Right? And if you don't know a jerk at work, you might be the jerk at work. So you might need to use this model anyway. So you can use this model to understand those difficult people at work, but you can use it to understand immigrants. You can use it to understand refugees. You can use it to understand people who have political differences than you, or maybe a different gender identity to you. You can use this model of context, conditions, and choices to try to make some space to understand difference. Now, you might be asking yourself, why should you care? Why does it matter to reach out to people and try to understand? Or why is this diversity thing? You always hear this push for this diversity thing. Diversity is important, right? Why? And the answer is because diversity is the greatest tool that humans have. And if you don't believe me, use that imagination again. Go back into history and look at the times of the greatest medical developments, scientific developments, the greatest poetry, literature, artwork, everything. All the things that humans do best rose the greatest in times when different populations were in different places and were open to discussing with one another. And right now, we face some of the greatest problems humanity has ever encountered. And so we need each other. We need to blend our imaginations. We need to build better and more interesting universes in fiction. But also, we need to bring all those ideas to the present. So, 2 things for you to take away from this. The first is practicing empathy, and this has 2 parts. So you get kind of like a 2 and 2 here, right? So 2 parts. Practicing empathy begins by reading, by listening, by playing, and by consuming things that are made by people who are different than you, whether that be a different race, a different religion, a different gender, a different location, wherever it might be. If they're different than you, their imagination will be different, and maybe you can source those ideas for problem solving. And the other part of this, of course, is use the 3 C's, right? Context, conditions, and choices. And you can do that even while you're reading or consuming fiction. You can say, look, what's this person's context? It's actually much more easy in some ways to do it with the villains of stories for some reason. I don't know why. But it is. Because then you can say, how do you understand what this person's doing? what were the conditions of their life, and now why are they trying to take over the world and, dominate everything, right? So you can use that. And the second thing you should do is take a breath once in a while. So everybody take a breath with me really quick. You ready? That breath is really important when you're dealing with someone who is different than you, and especially if they're difficult. That breath can give you just enough space so that you can listen, not to respond or inject your opinion, but listen to understand. You have to find an opening with people who are different than you. And listening to understand can give you that one space, that one breath to try and create a doorway for better understanding one another. And hopefully, with that space, we can work together to build a better world. Thank you.